papers were signed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Clifford Hayes had nothing left but a duffel bag, a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and a German Shepherd named Kodak, who kept pressing his nose against the passenger window like he could smell something the rest of the world had already forgotten. Clifford didn't cry when he drove away from the house. He had spent 31 years in the army, learning not to do things like that in front of witnesses. The neighbors were out, of course. They always were when something like this happened. He nodded at old Pete Dunnigan across the street, who had the decency to look away. The house had been Barbara's idea. The neighborhood, the school district, the finished basement, with the wet bar she never used, all of it. And then, after the kids were grown, and the mortgage was nearly done, she had sat across from him at the kitchen table, with a lawyer's card in her hand, and told him she wanted out. She was calm about it. That was the part that had stayed with him. The way she had folded her hands on the table like she was about to discuss a grocery list. 27 years of marriage, ended on a kitchen table in 40 minutes. He didn't contest the house, didn't contest much of anything, which his son Patrick told him later had been a catastrophic mistake. Maybe it was, but Clifford had seen catastrophic before, and a house in Dayton, Ohio didn't quite measure up. What he had left, after the lawyers were finished, and Barbara had taken what the court said was hers, amounted to his military pension, a savings account with enough to keep him going for a year if he was careful, and a storage unit on the edge of town containing a recliner, 3 boxes of books, and his father's old rifle wrapped in a wool blanket, and Kodak. Kodak was 7 years old, a big working-line shepherd Clifford had brought home as a puppy from a breeder in Tennessee. Barbara had never liked the dog. Too much hair, she said, too much energy, too much of everything she didn't want in her house. Clifford had always suspected she resented Kodak the way she eventually came to resent him. Not for anything specific, but for taking up space she had decided she wanted back. When the mediator asked who would keep the dog, Barbara had waved her hand like she was shooing something away. Good, Clifford had thought. At least we agree on that. He drove north without a plan. That was the truth of it, though he would have been embarrassed to admit it to anyone who asked. Clifford Hayes had spent 3 decades operating on schedules, orders, contingency plans, fallback positions. He had led men through things that didn't have names in any field manual, and now he was driving north on I-75 in October with a dog in the passenger seat and no particular destination, because there was nowhere he particularly needed to be. Kodak fell asleep somewhere past Lima. His big head drooped against the door, and Clifford could hear him breathing slow and steady in the way dogs breathe when they've decided everything is fine. Clifford envied him that. He hadn't been back to his father's place in 12 years. The old man had died in the spring of 2014, a Tuesday in April that Clifford had spent 7,000 miles away during a deployment he couldn't talk about in any detail. He'd flown back for the funeral, spent 4 days in Presque County settling the immediate affairs, and then left again because the Army required it. The property had gone into a kind of legal limbo, paid off, no mortgage, but tied up in an estate that took 18 months to clear. By the time it was formally his, he was back overseas, and the simplest thing had been to do nothing. Pay the property taxes remotely, leave the rest alone. His father had been a quiet man who had also served, though in a different war, in a different world. Clifford knew him mostly through short phone calls, Christmas visits, and the kind of silence that 2 men who have been in combat share without ever quite discussing it. His father had bought the property in Presque County in 1971, 42 acres of mostly wooded land, with a farmhouse that had been old even then, and he'd spent 30 years making it livable through stubbornness and an almost compulsive preference for doing things himself. When Clifford pulled off the highway and the road started narrowing, Kodak woke up. He lifted his head and his ears came forward, that particular sharpening that shepherds do when something in the air changes. He pushed his nose to the window crack, and his tail moved once, twice, against the seat. "Yeah," Clifford said. Me too. The gravel lane that led to the farmhouse was barely distinguishable from the grass on either side of it. 12 years of no one driving it had let the field encroach from both edges, and the birches at the far end had dropped enough branches to turn the whole approach into an obstacle course. Clifford drove it at 5 miles an hour, the truck lurching over ruts that had heaved and frozen and thawed until they'd become something close to trenches. The house came into view around a bend. He sat in the truck with the engine running for a moment. It was standing, which was more than he'd feared. The roof looked intact from here. The porch had lost a railing on the left side, and the front steps were tilted at an angle that suggested the frost had gotten under the concrete. But the structure was there. The windows were dark but unbroken. A maple that hadn't been planted when his father was alive had grown up along the east wall and was now pressing one heavy branch against the gutter. Kodak was whining softly, which meant he wanted out. Clifford cut the engine. The cold hit him when he opened the door, the particular cold of inland Maine in October, which was different from any other kind of cold in the way that it carried the smell of wet leaves and frozen ground underneath it. He stood beside the truck and breathed it in and didn't say anything for a while. Kodak circled once, nose down, then looked back at him like he was waiting for instructions. "Explore," Clifford said. The shepherd took off toward the tree line at the back of the property with a purpose that looked almost military. Clifford went to find the key, which his father had always kept in the same place, under a particular flat stone at the base of the porch steps. The stone was still there. He crouched and lifted it, and there was the key, orange with rust, on a ring with a small brass tag engraved with the letter H. The front door required his shoulder. The frame had shifted either from settling or from the years of freeze and thaw, and the door moved grudgingly, scraping against the threshold. The air inside was cold and still, and carried the smell of old wood and something else underneath it. Not rot, exactly, but time. The smell of a place that has been waiting. He stood in the front room for a moment. His father's chair was still there. The wood stove. The shelf of paperback westerns lined up with a precision that looked almost military. A coffee mug on the counter with a ring of dried brown in the bottom of it, 12 years old now. He wondered what his father had been doing the morning he last used it, whether he'd known. Clifford sat down in the old chair and let the silence be what it was. The first week was about survival in the literal sense. Water, heat, light. The well pump needed a new pressure tank, which required a trip to the hardware store in Carver Falls, a town of 4,000 that was 40 minutes down the mountain, and had a single hardware store run by a man named Art, who seemed constitutionally unsurprised by anything. The wood stove needed its chimney cleaned. The generator in the barn worked after Clifford replaced the fuel line and sent up a brief, heartfelt prayer to whatever deity governed small engines. Kodak attached himself to every project. He sat in the truck on the hardware runs. He investigated the barn with the methodical intensity of a dog who has been given a job and takes it seriously. He slept at the foot of the cot. Clifford sat up in the front room, and when Clifford woke in the night, which happened more than he would have liked, Kodak was always awake already, watching him with an expression that Clifford had come to think of as patient. Barbara called once, a week in. Her voice was the same, measured, pleasant, uninvested. "I just wanted to make sure you were somewhere," she said. "I'm somewhere," he said. There was a pause. In the background, he could hear the particular acoustic signature of their house, the hum of the refrigerator he'd replaced 2 years ago, the way sound moved in those rooms. He recognized it with a physical precision that surprised him. "Patrick says you went to your father's property." "That's right." Another pause. He had learned in 27 years that her pauses were rarely about not knowing what to say. "Clifford," she said, and stopped. He waited. "Take care of yourself," she said finally. He told her he would and ended the call, and sat with the phone in his hand for a while. Kodak put his chin on Clifford's knee without being asked. "Don't," Clifford said, and then left his hand on the dog's head anyway. It was Kodak who found the door. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching or listening from today. It's one of my favorite things, finding out how far these stories travel. It was in the third week, on a cold afternoon, when the light came low and yellow through the bare trees. Clifford had spent the morning splitting wood, which was the kind of work that didn't require thinking, and had been walking the property afterward with Kodak to look at the fence line on the north edge. His father had kept 2 horses at various points, and the fencing was still there. Mostly, though, the wire had gone slack in places, and a section near the creek had been taken down by a fallen oak. Clifford was examining the oak when Kodak stopped. The shepherd was standing at the base of a slight rise at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the down section of fence. He wasn't moving. His ears were up and his tail was level, not tucked, not raised, but perfectly horizontal, which was the posture Clifford associated with him, having found something he wasn't sure about. "What is it?" Kodak looked at him, then back at the ground, then back at him. Clifford walked over. The ground at that spot was different from the ground around it. Barely. You would miss it entirely if you weren't looking, and even looking, it took him a moment to see it. The earth was slightly raised. The grass over it was a different shade of green than the grass beside it, even now in October, when everything was going brown. And there was a seam. He crouched and brushed away the leaves and dead grass with his gloved hand. A handle, iron, set flush in a rectangular panel that had been cut with precision and framed in pressure-treated lumber that was darker than the dirt around it. A door, horizontal in the ground, maybe 3 feet by 4. It was padlocked with a mechanism that had rusted badly, but not completely. Clifford sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment. He looked at Kodak. Kodak's tail moved once. "When did he build you?" Clifford said to the door. He didn't try to open it that day. He wasn't sure why. Some instinct that said this needed to be done deliberately, not in the fading light of an October afternoon. He covered it back up with leaves, not to hide it, but because it felt right, and he and Kodak walked back to the farmhouse in the last of the light. That night he dug through the boxes he'd brought from the storage unit until he found his father's correspondence, a shoebox his sister Nadine had passed along after the funeral, containing 20 years of receipts, letters, and miscellaneous papers. He hadn't opened it since 2014. He sat at the kitchen table with the wood stove going, and Kodak asleep on the rug, and went through the papers one by one. He found the receipt near the bottom of the box. It was from a company called Consolidated Groundworks out of Augusta, dated August 2001. The invoice described the work as residential subsurface storage installation. 1 unit, reinforced concrete, sealed access with ventilation. The amount paid was significant enough that Clifford had to read it twice. September 2001. Clifford set the receipt down on the table and sat for a while with that. His father had never said a word. He drove to Carver Falls the next morning for a bolt cutter and a flashlight with new batteries, and when he got back, he walked straight out to the north fence line without going inside first. Kodak was already at the door, sitting beside it like he'd been assigned. The padlock came apart more easily than he expected. The bolt cutter sheared through the shackle on the second try. He lifted the panel, which was heavier than it looked, with a groan of metal and a rush of cold, compressed air that smelled of concrete and machine oil, and something drier underneath. Concrete steps led down, 8 of them, narrow, steep. He put the flashlight beam on them and stood there a moment. Kodak pressed against his leg. "All right," Clifford said, and went down. The space at the bottom was larger than he had expected. It ran the length of the rise, maybe 20 feet by 12, with a ceiling just high enough to stand in comfortably. The walls were poured concrete. The floor was concrete. A ventilation pipe ran up through the ceiling at the far end. Along one wall, his father had built shelves, rough-cut lumber, braced and leveled, and on the shelves were crates, sealed containers, stacked goods that had been organized by someone who thought in systems. There were sealed buckets of grain, rice, dried goods, dozens of them. There were medical supplies in labeled plastic cases. There were tools, hand tools, organized on a pegboard rack. There was ammunition, stored in military-style metal containers that Clifford recognized immediately. There were water containers, 20-gallon, stacked in a corner. There was a manual water pump mounted to the wall. There was a shortwave radio, still in its original box, and there was a letter. It was on the shelf nearest the stairs, in an envelope. The envelope said Clifford in his father's handwriting, which was the precise, upright handwriting of a man who had learned to write by hand in a different era. He sat on the bottom step and opened it. "I expect you'll find this eventually," his father had written. "I built it after September. You'll understand the timing without me explaining it. I wasn't afraid. I just wanted to be ready. The land is paid for. The taxes are low. There's 42 acres and nobody between us and the tree line for 6 miles in 3 directions. I always thought you'd end up here one way or another. I know the army got most of you. But I also know what happens when it gives you back. Don't sit and rot. Fix the north fence. The creek floods in April. The Millers 2 properties over are good people. Learn which mushrooms are which before you eat them, not after. I love you, son. I was proud of you in ways I probably didn't say enough." Dad Clifford read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and sat at the bottom of the stairs for a while, in the cold dark with his flashlight aimed at the floor. Above him he could hear Kodak moving on the ground, his nails on the concrete lip of the opening. And then the shepherd appeared at the top of the steps and looked down at him. "I'm okay," Clifford said. Kodak came down the stairs anyway and sat beside him. He told Patrick about it on a phone call in November. His son was quiet for a long moment. "Dad," Patrick said finally, "you know what that's worth." "I know what it's worth," Clifford said. He was sitting on the repaired porch steps, watching Kodak work the tree line. "That's not the question I'm asking myself." "What question are you asking yourself?" He thought about it. "Whether I'm supposed to stay," he said. Patrick was quiet again. In the background, Clifford could hear his grandchildren, 2 of them, 5 and 7, whose names were Owen and May, involved in some domestic dispute that required volume. "Do you want to?" Patrick asked. Clifford watched Kodak disappear into the trees, then reappear, then sit at the tree line and look back at him. "Yeah," he said. "I think I do." The call from Barbara's lawyer came in December. He was in the barn when it happened, working on the tractor his father had left that needed a new fuel injector and an amount of patience that Clifford was slowly developing. His phone rang, and the number was one he didn't recognize. And when he answered, a man identified himself as Lawrence Gregg of Gregg and Putnam, and told him he was representing Barbara in a follow-up matter. Clifford set down his wrench. It turned out that Barbara, or someone advising Barbara, had done some research and learned about the Press County property. The original divorce settlement had focused on the Dayton assets, the house, the retirement accounts, the savings. The Maine property had been listed as an inherited asset, classified separately, and Clifford's lawyer at the time had handled it correctly. It was his, clear and clean. But now Lawrence Gregg was telling him that Barbara was contesting the classification, that she intended to argue the property had appreciated in value during the marriage and should be subject to equitable distribution, that she was prepared to file a motion. Clifford listened to all of this without interrupting. When the lawyer finished, Clifford said, "She's going to argue that she's entitled to half of my father's land." There was a brief pause. "Mrs. Hayes's position is that." "I heard you," Clifford said. "I'll have my attorney call you." He ended the call. He stood in the barn for a moment. The tractor sat in pieces in front of him. Through the open barn door, he could see the farmhouse, and the bare birches and the gray December sky, and Kodak sitting on the porch steps, watching the barn door with his ears up, waiting. Clifford felt something settle in him. Not anger, exactly, though it was related. More like clarity. The kind that comes when a situation stops being ambiguous. He called Patrick, who had a colleague who knew a property attorney in Maine. That attorney, a methodical woman named Ellen Cross in Carver Falls, Spent 2 sessions with Clifford going through the timeline, the original estate documents, the classification in the settlement, and the specific language Barbara's lawyer was relying on. At the end of the second session, she set her pen down and looked at him over her reading glasses. "Your father acquired this property in 1971, she said. "You inherited it in 2014 through a clear probate process. The settlement documentation in the Ohio proceeding explicitly categorized it as separate inherited property. Her argument has serious procedural problems. Can she make it expensive for me regardless?" Clifford asked. Ellen Cross tilted her head. "She can try, but she won't win." "Mr. Hayes," she said, "she will not win." He paid her retainer, drove home, and told Kodak about it on the porch steps that evening, because there was no one else immediately available. And the shepherd was a good listener. The thing about Kodak was that he never looked at Clifford with pity. Dogs didn't do pity the way people did. He looked at him with attention, with that particular focused intelligence that working-line shepherds carry in their face, and Clifford found, over the months, that this was what he had needed without knowing it. Not sympathy, just presence, just the evidence that something alive was paying attention, and had decided he was worth staying near. Barbara's motion was filed in February and dismissed in April. Ellen Cross sent him the ruling as a PDF attachment with a 2-line email. As expected, the court found no basis for reclassification. "You're clear." He read the email in the farmhouse kitchen, with the window above the sink, showing him the north field, which was coming out of the frost now, and had gone the pale green of very early spring. The creek had flooded in April, as his father had promised. The Millers, whose first names were Tom and Cecilia, had brought a casserole in January, and helped him understand which of the county roads turned to mud and which didn't. He had identified 7 edible mushroom species so far, cautiously, from a field guide he'd ordered in November. He had rebuilt the north fence over the winter, section by section, during the hours when the cold let up enough to work outside. He put the phone face down on the table. Kodak was at his feet, asleep, turned on his side, with his legs extended the way shepherds sleep when they're completely comfortable. His ribs moved with each breath. He'd put on good weight since they'd come up here. The vet in Carver Falls, an even-tempered young woman named Dr. Hale, had looked him over in November and said he was in excellent shape for 7, which was a good age for the breed, and that he'd probably give Clifford another good 5 or 6 years if he stayed active, which he showed every indication of doing. Clifford had almost said, "He saved me, you know." He hadn't, because it would have required too much explaining. But it was true in the specific way that things are true when you have the distance to see them clearly. Kodak hadn't done anything dramatic. He had not, in any practical sense, rescued anyone. He had simply refused to leave. Every morning he was there. Every night he was there. In the hours when the farmhouse was very quiet, and Clifford's thoughts went to dark places, as they did, as they had always done since the first deployment, and more since the divorce, Kodak would appear and put his head on Clifford's, or press his flank against Clifford's leg, and simply be present, with that infuriating, uncomplicated certainty that dogs have, the certainty that says, "I'm here, and you're here, and that's enough for right now." It turned out that was enough for right now. In late April, on an evening when the light lasted long enough to do things. After dinner, Clifford carried a folding chair out to the rise at the north fence line, and sat beside the door his father had built in the ground, which he'd left open these days to air it out. He'd been down in it twice since December, once with Tom Miller, who'd looked around at the shelves and the stores and said simply, "Your dad was a serious man," and once alone, going through the inventory carefully, making a list of what was still good and what needed to be replaced. He was going to have to make some decisions about what to do with what was down there. Ellen Cross had walked him through the value, once the property question was settled, and the figure was substantial. Not change your life money, but security money. Sit down at the table and know you're okay money. And that was a different thing than he'd had in October. The evening light came through the birches at a low angle and put long shadows across the north field. Kodak sat beside the chair, pressed against his leg. Clifford thought about his father, writing that letter and going back upstairs, and having a cup of coffee, and never saying a word. He thought about the 12 years the door had sat in the ground waiting, and the way Kodak had stopped at exactly that spot on exactly that afternoon, and he thought, not for the first time, about how events arrange themselves in ways that can only be read backward, never forward, and how the worst year of his life had ended, with him sitting on 42 acres in Maine, in the spring light, with a good dog and a letter from his father, and no particular reason to be anywhere else. He wasn't sure what he believed about things like that. He was sure that the fence was fixed and the water ran clean, and the woodpile behind the barn was full, and that in 6 weeks the lower field would be ready for whatever he decided to plant in it. He put his hand on Kodak's head. "Good dog," he said. Kodak leaned into his hand and looked out at the field with him. The light came down through the birches slow and golden, and the shadow stretched long across the grass, and the land held them both the way it had held everything before them, quietly, without ceremony, without needing to be asked.